The underground bunker beneath Rassenburg smelled of damp concrete and stale tobacco. It was 2:47 a.m. on March 31, 1943, when Generaloberst Hans Jeschneck burst through the steel door, his normally composed face drained of color. In his trembling hand, he clutched a decoded intelligence report still warm from the decryption room. "Mein Gott," he whispered, though the words carried through the war room like a thunderclap. Field Marshal Erhard Milch looked up from the tactical maps spread across the oak table, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Jeschneck couldn't speak. He simply slid the report across the polished wood. Milch's face went through a transformation as he read. Confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching horror. The paper detailed the previous night's raid. 27 heavy bombers had penetrated deep into the Ruhr Valley, evading the entire Kammhuber Line defensive network. They'd struck the Möhne and Eder dams with surgical precision. The resulting floods had destroyed hydroelectric stations, drowned munitions factories, and severed transportation arteries that fed the entire industrial heart of the Third Reich. But it wasn't just the devastation that paralyzed these two men. It was the aircraft responsible. The Avro Lancaster, the same four-engine bomber they dismissed 18 months earlier as the British coffin with wings. The same aircraft their intelligence analysts had concluded was too slow, too vulnerable, and too conventional to matter in the evolving air war. Luftwaffe pilots had joked about it in ready rooms, called it the flying barn door because of its broad, ungainly profile. Now that barn door had just kicked in Germany's front teeth. Milch's jaw tightened as he stared at the mission parameters. 8,000 pounds of ordnance per aircraft to this range. How? They modified them, Jeschneck said, his voice hollow. Removed the bomb bay doors entirely. Created special weapons, bouncing bombs that skip across water like stones. He laughed, a brittle, broken sound. We were watching for the Americans and their daylight raids. We fortified every obvious target. And the British, they sent their joke bomber to destroy what we thought was indestructible. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was breaking. Neither man spoke. They both understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Lancaster had just demonstrated that Germany's entire defensive strategy, built on the assumption that British bombers lacked the payload capacity, range, and precision for strategic demolition, was obsolete. In the months to come, that realization would only deepen. But in that moment, in that bunker, all they could do was stare at the report and understand. They'd been wrong. Catastrophically wrong. 14 months earlier, in the mahogany-paneled briefing room at Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin, the laughter had been genuine. Major Wolfgang Falk stood at the podium, clicking through reconnaissance photographs of the new British heavy bomber. Each image drew fresh chuckles from the assembled fighter aces and intelligence officers. One photo showed the Lancaster from below, its enormous wings creating a cross-like silhouette against the clouds. "Gentlemen," Falk said with theatrical gravity, "I present to you the British Empire's answer to our night defenses. Note the generous wingspan, perfect for our anti-aircraft gunners who struggle with moving targets." More laughter. Observe the 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, loud enough to wake sleeping Luftwaffe pilots from 10 kilometers away. Oberleutnant Heinz Schnaufer, who would later become the top-scoring night fighter ace of the war, raised his hand. "What's the defensive armament?" 8.303 machine guns, Falk replied. "The same caliber the British infantry used in the last war. Against our 20mm cannons." He paused for effect. "I'm told our engineers are concerned the Lancaster might be too dangerous for British crews." The room erupted. Officers slapped tables. Someone made a joke about the British finally building bombers large enough to match their egos but too slow to match their rhetoric. General Major Joseph Kammhuber, architect of Germany's layered air defense system, remained seated at the back of the room, studying the photos with more interest than amusement. "What's the bomb load?" he asked quietly. Falk consulted his notes. "Intelligence estimates 14,000 pounds maximum, but realistically, 8 to 10,000 for operational ranges. And range, 2,300 kilometers with full payload." Kammhuber nodded slowly. These numbers bothered him, though he couldn't articulate why. The Lancaster was indeed slower than the newer American bombers, cruising at only 200 miles per hour. It was less heavily armed than the American B-17 Flying Fortress, which bristled with heavy machine guns. Its defensive strategy appeared to rely on darkness and altitude rather than overwhelming firepower. But something about the aircraft's simplicity nagged at him. There were no revolutionary features, just a straightforward design with excellent load capacity and range. It was practical, workmanlike, and the British didn't typically build workmanlike weapons. They built Spitfires and Mosquitoes, elegant, fast, innovative. One more thing, Falk added, as if reading Kamhuber's thoughts. The British are replacing their Stirlings and Halifaxes with these, making it their primary strategic bomber. Then they're making a mistake, Schnaufer declared. Our night fighters will feast on them. Mark my words, by this time next year, Lancaster squadrons will be refusing to fly. The assembled officers nodded in agreement. The British had briefly terrified Germany with their 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942. But that was quantity over quality. This Lancaster was supposed to be a quality aircraft, yet it brought nothing new to the table. No pressurized cabin. No cutting-edge technology. Just size, range, and payload. The Luftwaffe had faced the Wellington, the Whitley, the Hampton. They'd learned to shred them all. What was one more British bomber? As the briefing ended and officers filed out, discussing tactics for countering the new threat, only Kamhuber remained behind, studying the photographs in the empty room. He traced his finger along the Lancaster's fuselage, noting how the entire bomb bay appeared to be a single, uninterrupted space. How the wings were mounted high on the fuselage, leaving room below. He thought about payload capacity, about what you could do with 14,000 pounds of explosives if you weren't constrained by bomb bay doors or structural limitations. Then he shook his head and collected his papers. The Americans were the real threat. Everyone knew that. Roy Chadwick didn't look like a man designing the future of aerial warfare. At 50 years old, he was soft-spoken, methodical, and prone to anxious fidgeting with his glasses when presentations weren't going well. And in the spring of 1940, standing before a skeptical committee at the British Air Ministry, the presentation was definitely not going well. "Let me understand," said Air Vice Marshal Arthur Harris, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "You want us to fund a 4-engine bomber that's essentially a scaled-up version of your Manchester. The same Manchester that's currently killing more British aircrews through engine failure than German fighters are?" Chadwick felt his collar tighten. "The Manchester's problem is the Vulture engines, sir. Unreliable, underpowered. This design uses 4 Merlins instead. The same engines powering our fighters," Harris interrupted. "Which we don't have enough of. Actually, sir, Rolls-Royce is producing—" "Mr. Chadwick," Harris leaned forward. "Britain is being bombed nightly. Our cities are burning. We need bombers now, not in 2 years. We need proven designs, not experiments. The short Stirling is operational. The Hanley Page Halifax is entering service. Why should we divert resources to an unproven Avro design that's essentially starting from scratch?" This was the moment Chadwick had been dreading. He took a breath and made his gamble. "Because, sir, neither the Stirling nor the Halifax can carry the weapons we're going to need to truly hurt Germany." The room went silent. Harris's expression shifted from irritation to interest. "Explain." Chadwick approached the model on the table, a scale representation of his proposed Lancaster. "The Stirling has bomb bay limitations because of its fuselage structure. Maximum bomb size, 2,000 pounds. The Halifax is better, but still limited. Both aircraft were designed around existing bombs." He pointed to the Lancaster's belly. "This is designed around future weapons. A single, uninterrupted bomb bay 33 feet long. No internal bulkheads. No structural obstructions. To carry what, exactly? Anything we can imagine, sir. 4,000-pound cookies. 8,000-pound earthquake bombs. If someone invents a 12,000-pound weapon, this aircraft can carry it. The others can't." Harris studied the model. "Payload? 14,000 pounds to Germany and back. £22,000 for shorter ranges. A civilian engineer from Vickers spoke up. That's impossible. The structural load is distributed through the wing spar, which runs continuously through the fuselage, Chadwick said quickly. The wings bear the weight, not the fuselage skeleton. It's actually simpler than traditional designs. Stronger, too. Harris walked around the table, examining the model from every angle. Outside, air raid sirens began their nightly wail, London's soundtrack for 1940. The committee members instinctively glanced toward the windows, though the blackout curtains revealed nothing. How long? Harris asked finally. First prototype flies in 9 months. Production aircraft in 18. Make it 12 and 15, and you have your funding. Harris straightened. But understand this, Mr. Chadwick, if your bomber fails, if it's another Manchester, you'll have wasted resources we can't afford to waste. British air crews will die in obsolete aircraft while waiting for yours. That blood will be on your hands. Chadwick nodded, throat tight. Yes, sir. But the committee's skepticism was nothing compared to what came next. Actually building the thing. The first prototype nearly killed its test pilot. On January 9, 1941, Captain H.A. Sam Brown lifted the Lancaster into the frigid air above Woodford Aerodrome and immediately felt something wrong. The controls were mushy, unresponsive. The aircraft wanted to wallow like a pregnant whale. She's heavy in the nose, Brown reported over the radio, wrestling the yoke. Trim's all wrong. On the ground, Chadwick's heart sank. Months of calculations, of sleepless nights redesigning the Manchester's airframe, all potentially for nothing if the flight characteristics were unsound. But Brown was a test pilot of the old school. Steady hands, ice water in his veins. He spent 40 minutes in the air, testing every configuration, every speed, documenting every quirk. When he landed, his first words were, "She'll fly, but she needs work." 6 weeks of modifications followed. The tail assembly was redesigned. The wing incidence was adjusted. Control surfaces were rebalanced. When Brown took the revised Lancaster up again, his radio transmission was brief. "Gentlemen, we have a bomber." Production began at 5 factories across Britain. Workers, many of them women who'd never touched an aircraft before, assembled Lancasters in shifts that ran around the clock. The learning curve was brutal. Early aircraft had issues with hydraulic systems, electrical faults, landing gear that collapsed on touchdown. Flight Sergeant Jack West, assigned to test fly production aircraft before delivery, kept a journal that captured the frustration. March 1942. Took up Lancaster R5540 today. Port outer engine quit at 8,000 feet. Landed on 3. Aircraft grounded for engine replacement. How are we supposed to win a war with aircraft that can't make it past English coast? April 1942. New batch of Lancs from Woodford. Better. Much better. Flew one for 4 hours straight. Smooth as silk. Maybe Chadwick knew what he was doing after all. May 1942. First squadron now operational. Boys seem confident. Me? I've seen too many bombers come and go. Let's see how she does when the Germans start shooting back. Baptism by fire. The first operational Lancaster mission launched on March 3, 1942. 4 aircraft from 44 Squadron took off to lay mines in the Heligoland Bight. It was an unspectacular debut. A milk run designed to ease crews into the new bomber. All 4 returned safely. The real test came 7 weeks later on April 17th. 12 Lancasters were tasked with a daylight raid on the MAN diesel engine factory in Augsburg, deep in southern Germany. It was an audacious plan, perhaps too audacious. The bombers would fly at treetop level across occupied France, climb to bombing altitude only at the last moment, strike the factory, and race home before German fighters could fully respond. Squadron leader John Nettleton led the formation. In the cramped cockpit of his Lancaster, surrounded by the thrumming roar of 4 Merlins, he checked his watch. 15:27. They'd crossed into French airspace 12 minutes ago. So far, no contact. Then the radio crackled. "Fighters 11 o'clock low." Nettleton looked left and saw them. 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109s, climbing hard from an airfield they'd just overflown. The German pilots had scrambled quickly, and now they had altitude advantage. "Tighten up," Nettleton ordered. "Gunners, watch your fields of fire." The 109s attacked from the sun. The first pass was devastating. Nettleton watched helplessly as the Lancaster beside him, flown by his friend Warrant Officer Rhodes, took 20mm cannon rounds through the starboard wing. Fuel sprayed. Fire bloomed. The big bomber staggered, nose down, and cartwheeled into a French field at 300 miles per hour at NO parachutes. The formation scattered. Nettleton shoved the control yoke forward, diving toward the deck where the Lancaster's top turrets could bring guns to bear. Behind him, his rear gunner, Sergeant Jim Clay, opened up with both .303 Brownings, tracers arcing toward a pursuing 109. "Got him," Clay shouted. "He's smoking." But two more Lancasters went down before the fighters broke off, low on fuel. Nettleton led the remaining aircraft onward. They climbed to 12,000 feet as they approached Augsburg, the factory visible through broken clouds. A sprawling complex of buildings beside the Lech River. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, filling the sky with black puffs that buffeted the bombers like invisible fists. "Bomb doors open," Nettleton's bomb aimer called. "Steady, steady, bombs gone." 42,000 pounds of high explosive tumbled toward the man factory. Nettleton didn't wait to observe results. He rolled the Lancaster into a diving turn, engines screaming, fleeing south toward Switzerland with more fighters on his tail. .7 Lancasters made it home. 49 men didn't. The mission was technically successful. The factory was damaged, production disrupted. Nettleton received the Victoria Cross. But in the ready rooms and mess halls of Bomber Command, the Augsburg raid became a cautionary tale. The Lancaster might be capable, but daylight missions deep into Germany were suicidal. The bomber needed darkness. Through the summer and fall of 1942, Lancasters joined the night bombing campaign. They flew in streams hundreds strong, their exhausts glowing orange in the darkness as they droned toward German cities. Cologne, Essen, Hamburg, Dusseldorf. The aircraft proved remarkably survivable. Pilots reported coming home on 2 engines, with huge holes torn through wings and fuselage. The Lancaster could absorb punishment that would have downed its predecessors. Flight Lieutenant William Reed's experience became legendary. On November 3, 1943, his Lancaster was hit by a night fighter over Dusseldorf. The windscreen shattered, peppering Reed with glass. A shell fragment tore through his shoulder. His navigator was killed instantly. The aircraft's elevator controls were damaged. Reed could have turned back, should have turned back. Instead, he continued to the target, dropped his bombs, and nursed the crippled Lancaster back across the channel. He landed with blood freezing on his flight suit, having flown for 4 hours with untreated wounds and a dead navigator at his feet. He survived. His Lancaster survived. And the Germans began to realize they had a problem. The monster emerges. In the basement laboratory of RAF Scampton, a group of engineers gathered around a strange metal cylinder in January 1943. It didn't look like a bomb. It looked like an oil drum with fins. But this peculiar device was about to change everything the Luftwaffe thought they knew about aerial warfare. Barnes Wallis, the engineer who designed the Wellington bomber, held a pointer and addressed the assembled aircrew of 617 Squadron. "Gentlemen, you're looking at Upkeep, a 9,000-pound depth charge designed to bounce across water." Pilot Officer Dave Shannon frowned. "Bounce, sir?" "Precisely." Wallace clicked to the next slide, technical drawings showing trajectories, spin rates, water resistance calculations. Traditional bombs dropped on dams simply explode at the surface. The water absorbs most of the blast. Upkeep will skip across the reservoir like a stone, strike the dam wall below the waterline, sink, and detonate at depth. The water pressure will amplify the explosion directly against the structure. Squadron leader Guy Gibson, recently appointed to command this special squadron, studied the bomb with professional interest. "What's the release altitude?" 60 feet above the water. At precisely 240 miles per hour. The bomb must be spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute before release. The room went silent. 60 feet. night, while being shot at. "You're joking," someone muttered. "I assure you I am not." Wallace's expression was grave. "The dams in the Ruhr Valley are the arteries of German industry. Destroy them, and you destroy the water that cools the steel mills, generates electricity, and transports materials. But they're protected by anti-aircraft guns, torpedo nets, and the assumption that they're simply too massive to damage from the air." Gibson exchanged glances with his crews. They were the best, hand-picked from across Bomber Command for this mission. But this was beyond anything they'd trained for. "How many practice runs do we get?" Gibson asked. 6 weeks. Christ. For the next month and a half, modified Lancasters thundered across English reservoirs at wavetop height. Gunners called out altitudes while pilots fought to maintain precise speed and heading. Bomb aimers crouched in the nose, using simple wooden sights to judge the exact release point. Crashes were inevitable. 2 Lancasters hit the water during low-level training runs. 10 men died, but gradually, impossibly, the crews began to master the technique. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 Lancasters took off from Scampton. They flew in 3 waves, navigation lights dark, hugging terrain at 100 feet above the ground. German radar operators watched blips racing across their screens, low-level contacts that vanished into ground clutter before fighters could intercept. Gibson led the first wave toward the Möhne Dam. As they approached, searchlights blazed to life. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, red tracers climbing from fortified positions on the dam's towers. Gibson descended to 60 feet above the reservoir, his flight engineer counting down speed: 250, 245, 242. The Lancaster shuddered as the spinning upkeep released from its modified bomb bay. Gibson hauled back on the yoke, clearing the dam wall by meters. Behind him, his wireless operator watched the bomb bounce. Once, twice, 3 times, then disappear against the dam's face. 10 seconds later, the reservoir erupted. A column of water shot 800 feet into the air. The dam wall trembled but held. Gibson keyed his radio. "Hello, all cooler aircraft. I am going to attack. Stand by to come in to attack in your order when I tell you." 5 more Lancasters attacked. The 5th bomb breached the dam. 300 million tons of water exploded through the gap, a biblical flood that roared down the valley at 20 miles per hour. Gibson watched in awe as the wave front, 30 feet high, obliterated everything in its path. Power stations, factories, bridges, railways. The second wave hit the Eder Dam with similar results. When news reached Berlin, the response was stunned silence. The Möhne Dam was 112 feet thick at its base. German engineers had assured the High Command it was indestructible. Yet British bombers had punched through it with specialized weapons that should have been impossible to deliver. And they'd used Lancasters, those slow, ungainly joke bombers, to do it. The reckoning. In the intelligence assessment room of Luftwaffe 3 headquarters, Major Werner Bombach stood before a wall-sized map of northwestern Germany. Red pins marked the flooding's path. Blue pins marked destroyed or damaged facilities. There were a lot of blue pins. 12,000 dead, Bombach said quietly, reading from the casualty report. Mostly Russian laborers and French prisoners of war, but also German civilians. 600 hectares of agricultural land destroyed. The Ruhr industrial output is down 35% and will remain suppressed for at least 3 months. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring sat at the conference table, his normally bombastic demeanor subdued. "How did our defenses fail so completely?" "They didn't fail, sir. They were circumvented." Bombach changed slides. "The Lancasters approached at altitudes below our radar coverage. They flew routes that avoided our night fighter zones. And the weapon they used." He paused. "Sir, our intelligence had no indication such a weapon existed. We fortified against conventional bombs. These bouncing mines exploited a vulnerability no one anticipated. Then our intelligence failed. With respect, sir, no intelligence network could have predicted this. The British invented an entirely new attack methodology. And they used their Lancaster bomber, the aircraft we dismissed as mediocre, as the delivery platform. Goring's face reddened. I was assured the Lancaster posed no significant threat. That assessment was incomplete. Bomback clicked to reconnaissance photos of damaged Lancasters that had limped home from previous raids. We underestimated its survivability, its payload capacity, operational flexibility. The Lancaster can carry conventional bombs, mines, specialized weapons, whatever the mission requires. It operates at night when our fighters are less effective. And British crews are getting better at evading our defenses. General Joseph Camhuber, summoned from his Air Defense Command post, cleared his throat. If I may, Reichsmarschall, the problem is larger than one bomber. The British have created a strategic bombing system. Pathfinder squadrons that mark targets, main bomber forces that saturate defenses, and now specialized squadrons like 617 that conduct precision attacks. The Lancaster is the workhorse that makes this system possible. Goring slammed his fist on the table. Then we shoot them down. Increase fighter production. Deploy more anti-aircraft batteries. We've tried, sir. Camhuber's voice was patient but firm. Last month, Bomber Command flew 7,500 sorties. We shot down 219 aircraft, a 2.9% loss rate. Statistically significant, but nowhere near the 10% needed to make the campaign unsustainable for the British. Why not? Because the Lancaster can take damage that would destroy other bombers and still make it home. Camhuber produced a technical report. Luftwaffe pilots report that Lancasters are difficult to bring down even with multiple cannon strikes. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The structure is robust. And they carry enough defensive armament to make close approaches dangerous. Bomback added, we're also seeing an increase in electronic countermeasures. The British are jamming our radar with chaff strips of aluminum foil that create false returns. Our night fighter effectiveness has dropped 17% in the past 3 months. The room fell silent. Outside, Berlin was slowly recovering from its own night raid, the 17th in the past month. The constant bombing was grinding down German morale, disrupting production, and forcing the diversion of resources to air defense that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Goring looked at the map, his expression unreadable. When does this end? No one answered because they all knew the truth. It didn't end. Not as long as British factories kept building Lancasters. Not as long as British crews kept climbing into them. Not as long as the night belonged to Bomber Command. Double fighter production. Goring ordered finally. I want every available aircraft transferred to home defense. If we cannot stop these bombers, they will bleed us to death. But increasing fighter production meant diverting resources from other programs. It meant fewer tanks, fewer artillery pieces, fewer resources for other fronts. The Lancaster was forcing Germany into a defensive posture, draining its strength while Allied armies prepared to strike. In the strategic sense, the dam raids were more devastating than the physical damage suggested. They'd shattered German confidence in their defenses and proved that no target, however well-protected, however massive, was truly safe. The grind. Through late 1943 and into 1944, the bombing campaign became an industrial process. Lancasters flew in formations of 600, 700, sometimes 800 aircraft. They carried new weapons, 8,000-pound cookies that could level city blocks, 12,000-pound tallboy bombs that penetrated underground bunkers, and eventually the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the largest conventional bomb of the war. Pilot Officer Jim Chapman flew his first Lancaster mission in September 1943. His last was in March 1945. In between, he completed 41 sorties, a statistical miracle given that average crew survival rates were barely above 40% for a full tour. His logbook entries tell the story. September 8, 1943, Nuremberg. Heavy flak, no fighters. Dropped 8 by 1,000 pounds on rail yards. All aircraft returned. October 22, 1943, Kassel. Caught in searchlights for 90 seconds. Thought we were dead. Starboard outer took flak damage but kept running. Hit target area, city burning from end to end. January 14, 1944, Brunswick. Me-110 attacked from below. Flight engineer killed. Rear turret damaged. Continued to target. Bomb aimer took over navigation. Made it home on 3 engines. Hardest night of my life. June 6, 1944, coastal batteries. Normandy. Flew 3 sorties in 18 hours. Watched invasion fleet from 800 feet. We've actually pulled it off. We're going back to France. March 14, 1945, Chemnitz. No fighter opposition, they're out of fuel. Little flak, they're out of guns. Dropped everything we had on marshalling yards. War feels like it's ending. Hard to believe we're still here. For every Chapman who survived, there were crews who didn't. Lancaster losses totaled 3,345 aircraft by war's end. Nearly 70% of all Lancasters built. But they'd flown 156,000 sorties and dropped 618,000 tons of bombs. No other aircraft came close to that operational record. German night fighter ace Heinz Schnaufer, the same officer who'd mocked the Lancaster in that 1942 briefing, shot down 121 Allied bombers, many of them Lancasters. But even he developed a grudging respect for the aircraft. In a 1944 interview, he said, "The Lancaster is a dangerous opponent, can absorb tremendous damage. I've put dozens of cannon rounds into them and watched them continue flying. Their crews are brave, sometimes foolishly so. They maintain formation even when attacked. And there are so many of them. For every one we destroy, 3 more appear." The final accounting. On April 25, 1945, a Lancaster from 617 Squadron, the same unit that had bombed the dams 2 years earlier, dropped a Grand Slam bomb on the Valentine submarine pens near Bremen. The massive concrete structure, built to protect U-boats from aerial attack, collapsed under the impact. It was one of the last strategic targets in Germany. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks later. In the years that followed, historians and veterans debated the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. Some argued it had been essential to victory, that it had destroyed German industrial capacity, broken civilian morale, and forced the diversion of resources from other fronts. Others contended it had been wasteful, that the same effort applied to tactical support could have shortened the war more effectively. But there was no debate about the Lancaster itself. It had proven to be exactly what Roy Chadwick had promised. A versatile, survivable, heavy payload bomber that could carry any weapon designed for it. It had outlasted every other British bomber of the war. It had remained in production longer. It had dropped more bombs, flown more sorties, and destroyed more targets than any Allied bomber except the American B-24. Most importantly, it had done something no one expected in 1942. It had forced Germany to respect British strategic air power. The Germans had dismissed it as a joke, another British aircraft that would be easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Instead, the Lancaster became the nightmare that appeared every night in the darkness above German cities, carrying destruction that even the most heavily fortified targets couldn't withstand. The dams raid had been the dramatic demonstration, but the real victory was cumulative. 10,000 flights, each one grinding down German capacity a little more. Oil refineries destroyed. Railway yards shattered. U-boat pens collapsed. Every target represented resources Germany couldn't replace. Production capacity permanently lost. And through it all, the Lancasters kept coming. Roy Chadwick died in 1947 when a prototype airliner he designed crashed on takeoff. He was 54. He never saw the full recognition his Lancaster received. The museums where pristine examples now sit, the veterans' reunions where old men gather beneath its wings, the documentaries that call it the finest bomber of World War II. But on a warm afternoon in late 1945, after the war had ended and the bombers were being scrapped by the hundreds, Chadwick visited a Lancaster storage facility at Syerston. He walked among the rows of aircraft, hundreds of them, nose to tail, wings almost touching. Most would be broken up for scrap metal. A few would be preserved. He ran his hand along a fuselage scarred with flak damage, patched with riveted aluminum plates. The aircraft had survived dozens of missions, brought its crew home every time. Now it would be reduced to aluminum ingots. Was it worth it? Asked the airfield commander, walking beside him. Chadwick thought about the 55,000 Bomber Command aircrew who hadn't come home. About the German civilians killed in the raids. About the impossible calculus of war, where you measured success in tons of bombs dropped and percentage of targets destroyed. I designed an aircraft that could do a job, he said finally. Whether the job itself was worth doing, that's not for engineers to decide. The commander nodded. They stood in silence, surrounded by the bombers that had won a war and lost one at the same time. Mechanical predators that had brought devastation from the sky and then been discarded when the killing was done. Somewhere in the distance, a Lancaster's engines coughed to life, one of the few still airworthy, being ferried to a new home. The sound of 4 Merlins in harmony carried across the airfield. A deep, thrumming roar that had once filled German skies with dread. Chadwick listened until the sound faded, then turned and walked away. The war was over. The joke bomber had done its job. And in doing so, it had proven that in war, underestimating your enemy, even a slow, ungainly, obsolete enemy, could cost you everything. Germany had learned that lesson the hard way, one night raid at a time, until the darkness brought nothing but Lancasters and the dawn brought only ruins. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.